There's always a lot of discussion here on YouTube about which languages are the most difficult to learn. Is it Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, or maybe even Russian? Well, I've learned Chinese and Russian myself. I started with Chinese like 10 years ago, Russian like 2 years ago. So in this video, I'm going to tell you why I think Russian is more difficult to learn than Mandarin Chinese. Keep watching. Hey everyone, my name is Jan van der A and you're watching Language Boost, the channel for your language learning tips, tricks, and of course motivation. Now we're gonna do this video in kind of a laid back format. So I have my laptop here with my notes because recently someone tagged me in a discussion on Facebook where a guy wrote, I have been studying Chinese for about 6 years, and I must say it's the most frustrating language I ever studied in my life. If I could go back in time, I don't think that I would ever start learning Chinese again. Now, he gives a few reasons for why Chinese is so difficult to learn. So the first reason, he says, there aren't any cognates between English and Chinese. So that's true. If you want to learn Chinese, you really have to start from scratch because you're not going to be able to recognize any words. And what's also true is that it's difficult to learn new words because, well, if you don't know the syllables, if you don't know how to pronounce the words, you're not even going to be able to distinguish the different sounds. For example, in Chinese, you have syllables like xiang, shang, chang, chang. See, it can be very tricky to distinguish these sounds, but every syllable has another meaning, also depending on the tones, which is another problem, which I will discuss later in this video. So he says, yeah, pronunciation is hell. You can learn a word 10 times, and then sometimes they're still not going to be able to understand you. I always do recommend someone who wants to learn Chinese to really start with the basics, to really find a good teacher who helps you, who can really teach you how to position your mouth and your tongue. Because if you're not going to be able to pronounce all the syllables properly, then you have a big chance, quite a high chance that native speakers that the Chinese are not going to be able to understand you. In Russian, it's a little bit easier. Pronunciation is a little bit more straightforward. Of course, you have a few sounds which are pretty tricky. Like, for example, this T is not T, but more like T. And again, my Russian is far from perfect, actually. I'm still struggling to hold conversation, but these are just a few observations that I made. So pronunciation in Russian is much easier in Chinese if your native language is, well, English or any other European language, I would say. Of course, you have to learn how to roll your R in Russian, which can be tricky for me. This was one of the biggest pain points in Russian pronunciation. Then he says, passive listening hasn't helped much. I commute to work for a long time every day, which means that I have a lot of time to listen to Chinese podcasts and courses. But even after doing that for 5 years, almost every day, I still don't understand much. Well, I think I think this is a problem that people have when learning a foreign language in general. I think it's always very important. I think a mistake that many people make when they want to learn a foreign language, they say, okay, I want to learn German. Then I just listen to the radio in German or I just watch German television. But if you are a beginner, you're not going to be able to understand anything. At least your ear gets used to the German sound in this case. But you're not really going to be able to pick up new words because it's so-called incomprehensible input. Input is not comprehensible. You don't understand what's going on. If you don't understand what's going on, you cannot learn new words. So you need either to read along with a transcript or you need to listen to very simple content. You should at least be able to understand like 80 or 90%. So I think this is a problem not just for Russian, also for Chinese, is both very difficult. Now, he says that when you learn, there's many people who say that in Chinese you don't have any grammar. Well, you do have grammar in Chinese. The thing is that it's not very clear what the grammar rules are. So if you're learning Chinese as a beginner, it's pretty straightforward. You don't conjugate the verbs. You just learn a few words, you put them in the right order, and you have a correct sentence. But if you get to the more advanced stages, like word order, sometimes can be tricky. Although, when talking about grammar, this is really the most difficult thing about learning Russian, and I'm gonna give you a few examples. If you want to say, I want to go to school, for example. In Russian, you say, I want, you have to conjugate the verb to want. I want to go, but which to go? In Russian, you have lots of words for verbs of motion, as they call them. So, are you going on foot? Are you going by vehicle? Are you just going, or is it a habit? Is it a routine? Are you going and are you coming back? So based on if you're coming back or the vehicle you travel with, you have to pick the right verb. And then in Russian you have a thing which is called like perfective and imperfective verb. It's a little bit complicated. I'm not gonna explain in this video what the difference is, but what this means is basically in Russian you have two verbs for every verb, and then depending on if you put the stress on the process or on the result, you have to use one verb or the other. It's a bit tricky. I'm not going to explain it in this video, but so back to the example. I want to go to school. I want, you have to conjugate it. Want, then you have to you have to pick the right verb for to go. There's many possibilities here. To go to school. It's not school is škola, but to school it's a case školu. Okay, so these are all the grammar decisions that you need to make, or the grammar points you need to keep into account when making a simple sentence like I want to go to school. Now in Chinese, it's just I want go school, and you have a sentence. That's it. No grammar. Just if you know the words, put them in the right order, and that's it. As I said, if you reach more advanced level in Chinese, it gets a little bit more complicated. And so one might say that there is very little grammar in Chinese. As I said, Chinese grammar can be very blurry. It's not always clear. If I want to make a sentence like... how do you say that in English? Like, if I had known that, I would not have gone, right? In Russian, you have very clear grammar rules about how you make a sentence like this. But in Chinese, it's not very clear. In Chinese, they might say something like, 我早知道我就不去, which literally means, I early know, then I not go. You know, so if you are a Chinese learner and you hear the sentence, you know, you might understand every single word, might not be able to find out what this person means, because there is a lack of grammar. It's so much simplified that it can have that a certain phrase can have many meanings, and this can be very tricky in Chinese at the later stages. But again, as a beginner, I think that, of course, if you learn Chinese, you need to be able to pronounce the syllables clearly. You need to know, of course, how to use the tones, but once you know that, I think it's pretty straightforward. And you just put the words in the right order, and voila, you have a sentence. While in Russian, you can literally make 5 mistakes in a very simple sentence. And then, of course, there is the writing system. In Russian, you have the Cyrillic alphabet, which is pretty easy to learn. You can learn it if you're really good, in an hour, but otherwise in a day, maybe a few days. And then, getting comfortable with the Russian alphabet takes a little bit longer. But in Chinese, of course, they use Chinese characters, and learning the characters really takes a lot of time Chinese characters can be a pain in the ass for people who want to learn Chinese. But I always say, just focus on the spoken language and on Pinyin. I think that Pinyin is super important to learn. So this is basically the Chinese, like the Romanized system to write Chinese. So if you want to write ni hao, you don't write, which means hello, of course. You don't write the Chinese characters, but you just write ni hao, Nihao, and there you have it, ni hao. So Pinyin is like the writing system that often foreigners use to learn Chinese. And if you know the Pinyin very well, in theory, you should also you can also know how a certain word is pronounced. So I do think that's very important. And then the characters, if you're really interested in the characters, I do think it makes sense to learn to recognize them so that you can read Chinese and also type Chinese. Because if you type Chinese either on your phone or on your keyboard, you need to know the Pinyin, and then you just type the Pinyin, you select the character, and then you can basically type Chinese. And this is doable. I think you can learn this pretty easily. Of course, like writing all the Chinese characters by hand is this is another skill set which can take up until years. So my advice, if you're not obsessed by Chinese characters, just focus on the spoken language and on the Pinyin if you really like it, and later on you can learn the characters, but otherwise it can be too overwhelming in the beginning. Okay? So writing and reading is more difficult in Chinese than Russian. If it's about the spoken language, I think it's much easier to get started in Chinese. Then he also complains that there are two writing systems in Chinese. You have simplified and you have the traditional script, which is still used in Taiwan and Hong Kong. And then another thing is that in Russian there are basically no major dialects, right? So if you go to Moscow or to Vladivostok or to Astana in Kazakhstan or Almaty, you almost cannot hear the difference, which is pretty amazing. I'm from the Netherlands, a small country, but if I go to the next town, which is like 15 kilometers further, they can already hear that I'm not from that town. In Russia, they don't have this problem. So if you understand Russian, if you can speak it, you're not gonna have any problems with dialects or accents. In Chinese, in China, Mandarin is often not the language that people grew up with. Their native languages are often their dialects, and yes, almost everyone speaks Mandarin, but some of them have very thick accents. Like someone from Beijing can be very difficult to understand for like someone who speaks real like Beijing dialect, Beijing Hua, can be really tricky to understand. Actually, I do not understand much of it. And then, accents can be really strong. I still remember talking to the grandma of a Chinese friend of me who comes from Hunan province. Really a hard time to understand it. In Russia, you're not going to have this problem. Then he also says that traveling to China requires a visa. So it's difficult to just go there and practice your Chinese. It's the same problem in Russia. We need, most Western countries need a visa to visit Russia as well. And then here he ends the article by saying that I think I could have learned 3 or 4 languages in the same time that I learned Chinese. And I think that's true, and I think that it's the same for Russian. Chinese and Russian are both very different and are both very difficult to learn for someone who has English as a native language, or Dutch or German or any other European language. It's very different, very little similarities. And yes, I also do think that it's just as difficult to learn French, Italian, Spanish, and and Portuguese than learning just only Chinese or Russian. Which one is more difficult? In my opinion, it's Russian, because as a beginner, you can really make 10 mistakes in one sentence, and it's really difficult to get started and to use the right grammar. In Chinese, you have to master the tones and the pronunciation, but then you just put the words in the right order and you can actually start talking. Understanding advanced Chinese is very difficult. I do listen to like speeches of Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, and also like of Vladimir Putin. And Putin, I mean, although my Chinese is much better than my Russian, I do understand almost as much of a presidential speech, because I don't know, in Chinese they use all these expressions and all these difficult words, and my Chinese, I would say, is pretty good. I'm pretty fluent, but I get completely lost in a speech like that. While in Russian, those difficult words are often the same as in English or a Latin-based language, so it's easier to pick up those difficult words. Okay, now that was a lot of information. I hope this has given you an interesting perspective and insight on in these two languages, basically. Let me know what you think. What are your experiences learning Chinese or Russian? What are your biggest frustrations? Do you agree with everything that I said in this video? Or do you think, man, this guy... Well, then you're free to leave your comments in the comment section below. Thanks for watching and see you soon here on Language Boost. Ciao, ciao, до свидания, and bye-bye. 再见.